charter discussion I've heard begin has people saying, well, how do you handle this, how do you handle that, how do you handle the third thing? And in general, there's not one answer. There are a range of state laws that do different things. There are a range of local arrangements that do different things. So the heart of the Prichard Report is the 8 questions on that handout that was pointed out a little while ago. I brought this to give you the meat of the report. I brought about 20 copies of the whole report, but it's available at the Prichard Committee's website if anyone didn't get copies. I didn't want to burn more trees than people actually wanted copies for. So I bought some, knowing some people don't want to go hunting at the website. But I wanted to talk you through a few of the key points in thinking about each of these questions. Starting with what student results is a charter held accountable for. When charter schools started, most states did not have a full-scale accountability system. That became common with No Child Left Behind. And at that point, all states added some version of that. If Kentucky adds charter schools, Kentucky charter schools will be subject to Kentucky's accountability rules, with the note that, of course, we're changing those rules because No Child Left Behind has been replaced by the Every Student Succeeds Act. But and Kentucky has a bunch of flexibility about how we do that accountability, but one thing that's settled is all the schools you list as public schools, including your charter schools, are going to be subject to those rules. States have options of adding some additional things. In the original explanation of charters, there was the notion that charters could get some more things done for kids. So Kentucky could have rules that say charter schools need to tell us what extra value they're going to add. That's a genuine option for the state. But that's also something you're going to want to watch just the statewide accountability discussions. You know what the minimum is, and watch any bill that gets proposed to see if there's charter schools. Second issue that comes up is we keep saying charter schools get flexibility. What flexibility? And again, there are options. Almost everyone will say charter schools are subject to the rules for health, safety, non-discrimination, and maybe something about transparency. But that doesn't fill that. I live inside the Kentucky statutes. I don't really recommend it as a vacation home, but I do live inside them and spend a bunch of time. When I heard that, I immediately thought, which things fit which side? And that's why I brought the table on the back as an illustration of approximately what's going to be at stake when Kentucky has an argument about what's going to be required and what isn't. On the blue side of that column on the left are a set of state rules that public school folks are very used to living under that I think probably fit. Those are room for debate. That health, safety, non-discrimination, public transparency kind of categories. On the other side, a whole set of things that are precious to some folks involved in public education that maybe don't fit. And the point of the chart isn't to give a definitive answer if this is the right way to do it, but to tee up the issue. I think probably within this room we could probably get a good debate going on. Is the 2% contingency a reasonable requirement for good management of public money on the one side? And on the other side, is it right for kids to let schools out of identifying gifted children and making plans to meet their needs? So sort of from the bottom of the one chart to the top of the other, you can see things that I think a Kentucky debate is going to talk a bunch about what should we move back and forth. And that one folks to see the range of what could be at stake there. I will mention that in the middle of that green chart on the right, I think I've got every major education bill sponsored by Republicans in the last 10 years. And that's on the green, let's not do it anymore side of what might happen with charter schools. So the concern about kids doing physical activity, the concerns about offering college-ready courses. In the most flexible versions of what charter schools might be required to do, those things would not be required, even though they've been a great concern to some of the folks who are also advocating for charters. So that's a thing to see coming. Once you get past that, the next really big question is how do students end up at charter schools? How are they assigned or admitted? In that conversion charter model, it might be a school opening up in a building that already had a student population and the kids are still there. But the more common version of charters, they're startups, they're starting in a new building, they don't have past students, there's some admissions process. It's fairly common to say if there are more kids want to come than the school has space for, it's going to be done by a lottery. That is not guaranteed by saying this is a charter school. It's not guaranteed by saying we're passing a charter law. Deciding that charters have to use a lottery to decide who can come is something that either will or won't be in a Kentucky statute, and I think it's a very important thing to watch for. Going with that, lotteries fairly often have some preferences. A preference for siblings of kids who are already there, possibly a preference for kids who can add diversity to the school, possibly a preference for kids who are in schools that have had troubled results in the previous years. So there again, you want to watch who's getting those special opportunities. And you might watch for, do the kids all need to come from the same district, or can they come from the whole surrounding area? And how is transportation going to work if kids are coming from a broader space? Then to move to the big definition, the charter has those two sides to it. So the question, who's going to authorize it and who can apply to run one, are going to be important. States vary on that. The most common arrangement is local school boards decide and authorize the charters. Some states have universities able to authorize. Some states have their state board doing the authorization. 8 states have a special state agency set up to make those decisions. And that's another thing if you're opening up a charter bill to say what's happening here. Is that still a local decision? Is it moved up to the state? Can some other institutions step in and approve charters is something you really want to know to understand the design. On the other side, who can apply to run a charter school? Some states say only nonprofits, and I feel utterly confident that you're going to hear about how it can say nonprofit and not quite work that way. I've heard the stories, but I thought I'd defer to the full panel to have some sense of how that might not be implemented. Some states allow for-profits to apply. Some states say you have to be incorporated as a nonprofit before you can open your doors. But you can apply not having set up what your corporate governance is going to be and not having asked the federal government to recognize you as a nonprofit. I do want to mention there's a distinctive thing in Kentucky's Constitution, because there's a classic question, can a faith-based organization apply to run a charter school? Most states in the country, you would start talking about the First Amendment to figure that out. In Kentucky, our Constitution, Section 189, says, I'm going to read it to you. Right. No portion of any fund or tax now existing or that hereafter may be raised or levied for educational purposes shall be appropriated to or used by or in aid of any church, sectarian, or denominational school. So I do think one thing we know is that door is locked. People may try to come through it, but I think the structure is there. That goes back to when Kentucky had really ugly Catholic-Protestant wars going on. And I don't entirely mean wars metaphorically, if you know our history. But that piece moved in with the rules that no parent shall be required to send a child to a school. The parent is not approved of. And that was clearly a deal made a long, long time ago. Couple other issues. Will there be caps on the number of charters or rules about how many charters there can be? Classic forms of limitations are what size district can have them, usually tilted toward very large ones. You'll know if there's a district, you're in it. Sometimes there are limits on how many schools total can be open. Sometimes there are limits on what percent of a district's population can be enrolled in the charter schools, and that's a thing to look for. 19 states have no caps. So you don't know there are going to be caps except by looking through the law and finding here's where it says the limits. Question 7, I think, is the really heavyweight. How will charter schools be closed if they don't deliver? You could write the law to say if you don't meet this level of goal, you're closing. Every state says multiple years. And that's not a problem because there are kids in a troubled school. But it's a problem in any way trying to set up education because school change isn't usually a 3-month process. It's almost always a deeper process of building a culture that's going to work for the kids. I will add as a statistic that from 92 to 2011, roughly 6,700 charters opened and more than 1,000 closed. 19% of those were for academic reasons, not delivering what they said they would do for kids. 42% for financial reasons, 24% for mismanagement, and then the balance was a combination of other things like running out of facilities, and occasionally there isn't a record of why the school disappeared. Final question of the 8 questions is what funding will charter schools receive? There are a fair number of places where that's negotiated between the local school board and the charter school. And that's a negotiation that'll be sort of like the Middle East. Right? That's always, all parties are always saying the other guy got a better deal. But that happens. And if you're running an innovative school within the school system, you're also in those negotiations. What are we going to get? There's also an option for approval formulas. Kentucky's shining star of funding equalization is the big seat formula. That gives an impression at the first level that you can figure out what's a fair amount of money. I think it will be more difficult than it looks at first glance. And the big reason is because SEEK is built on both state and local money. Every district in the state has made a voluntary decision to tax itself more than the minimum 30 cents. Most districts in the state have made a decision to tax themselves so much more that the state stops equalizing it. So if you want to talk about charter funding, you can either do what the state guarantees, which will be way less than most schools run on, or you can set up rules that say local dollars that were set up by people to run their public school system are going to have to flow to charter schools. The other thing to watch for there is, because not all dollars are equalized, districts have different amounts of funding per pupil. So if you put together a charter school and kids are coming from Jefferson and Bullitt and Shelby, that may be different amounts of money flowing in from the different students, and that's going to be a thing that's going to be a lot of discussion if we go there at all. 2 other issues really quickly. Facilities funding comes from a separate stream in Kentucky, and the decision is always it's a 30-year investment to decide to borrow to build a school. So there's going to be a complicated discussion about how you arrange to have those really not growing on trees buildings that'll hold 150 kids in 6 different rooms where 30 kids have room to move around, with sprinklers and tornado shelter and a good plan for a live shooter situation. And I certainly hope some room for the kids to run around and bounce up and down and get some exercise. That's not an easy thing to find. The charter advocates will say we're being cheated because there's never enough for facilities. Everyone else will say you're being expensive because you always need more for facilities. It actually, and I think this is true internationally, I did some reading years ago on systems in other countries, and in the ways they offer parental choice, everybody's always fighting about facilities too. And the other issue that's going to be really intense is going to be state-funded employee benefits, because it's going to be a problem if the schools get to take the money and not put it in the benefits program. And it's going to be a noise if they're told this is what you've got to put up out of your budget, or watch the state move into this benefit system. It's a fundamental solidarity question of whether everybody rises and falls together, or whether people are going to peel off and do things separately. And given the challenges we've had with our pension system, that's not small. I do want to close with the briefest note on the research on charter schools. The Prichard study relied pretty heavily on the Credo study, which looked at students who came from different, similar backgrounds. They were called virtual twins. So they were looking for students of very similar demographic backgrounds who started out doing work at about the same level. And when they went through and then looked at performance later on, comparing the charter students and the non-charter students, they found very little impact for students overall. When they broke it out further, they found an important looking impact, though you can argue about whether the study was conducted perfectly. Their data looks like for African American students going to a charter school can be an important plus. For low income students, it can be a plus. For Hispanic students, if they come from low income families, charter schools can be a plus. For white students, charter schools are a net loss. And that's worth noting in the data. It looks neutral across the board if you break it out. There's some benefits, sometimes there's losses for some other groups. And there's a separate set of studies that I've been reading in the last week that look at students who won and lost charter lotteries. So they're similar in that their parents went to all the work to apply, and some of them ended up at a charter and some didn't. They have some similar findings. They didn't look at demographics directly, but they said, we're seeing some important gains for kids in urban charters, not anywhere else. So this is nobody's panacea, and then you can debate whether you're convinced by the argument for some populations, but it's not a brilliant market-based miracle where the fact that charter schools exist gets you some growth and achievement. I will admit, when I first heard the concept, I thought charter schools were set up to smoke everybody else, because the initial concept was the people founding it believe heartily in what they're doing, the teachers are there because they believe in this particular model, the parents send their kids because they believe in the model. So my recurring question to charter advocates is, so how come the data is ambiguous? Right? That sounds like you've got some things that would work well for kids. The data is ambiguous unless you break it down to that population level. And I think even then there are critics who will say that's not fully convincing. But on the other hand, there are people who will say very firmly, I see my kids as needing a kind of school that works very differently, and charters look like a way to get that to happen. And you can look at the studies and say, yes, for these groups of kids, past charters have shown they can do something. So that's my whole pitch. I will look forward to questions, but not until after you've heard the other two presentations.